Good morning, friends, and happy St. Nicholas Day, December 6th. This morning, I'm sharing with everyone St. Nicholas and the Nine Gold Coins by Jim Forrest, illustrated by Vladislav Andreev. St. Nicholas and the Nine Gold Coins. Once upon a time, there was a boy named Nicholas. Today, we call him St. Nicholas. But when he was growing up, everyone just called him Nick. Nick lived in a town called Patera, where ships came and went every day. You should have seen them. They were made of brightly painted wood, with tall masts that seemed to touch the sky, and had sails of every color. The men who made up the crew had an endless supply of tales to tell. Their close encounters with fabulous creatures, from sea monsters as big as islands to mermaids whose voices could pull a sailor beneath the waves. The sailors also filled Nick's thoughts and imagination with visions of distant ports and great cities: Alexandria, Antioch, Sidon, Tripoli, Carthage, Rome, Syracuse, and Ravenna. Such beautiful names. So many places, all so far away, but at the same time as close as any ship floating in Patera's harbor. It was Nick's dream to become a sailor and to travel to all the faraway ports that were beyond the horizon, yet shared the same sea in which he and his friends so often swam. In the meantime, he asked every sailor he met, "Where have you been? What was it like?" Nick's uncle was an important man. He was the bishop, but for Nick he was also both father and mother, as Nick's own parents had died early in his life. He was his uncle, and he taught him how to read and write. It pleased Nick that he'd been named after his uncle. Everyone respected the bishop, not only because he helped each person who came to him in need, but also for his faith and courage. As a young man, Nick's uncle had been beaten and imprisoned just for being a Christian. The two of them often went on walks together. His uncle enjoyed listening to Nick retell stories he'd heard from sailors. He had stories to tell as well, some from the gospel and some from his own experiences as bishop. "You don't have to go to sea to have adventures," he told Nick. "I promise you, wherever you live according to the gospel, you will have greater adventures than meeting sea monsters or hearing mermaids sing." For Nick, just being with his uncle was an adventure and an education. Nearly every day, his uncle found time to visit the sick. Nick was often at his side during these visits. "It's a never-ending journey getting to know people," said Nick's uncle. "Everyone has a story, and no two stories are alike." Nick thought of Mark, the neighbor who had lost a leg in an accident on board ship. His uncle not only changed Mark's bandages day after day, but he also changed Mark's mind. After his accident, Mark had wanted to die. "My life is over," he said, "and there's nothing for me to do." But Nick's uncle found a job for Mark mending nets, which helped Mark to stay alive. "Restoring hope can be a resurrection," his uncle told him. Nick also noticed how his uncle would sometimes quietly leave a coin as he was saying goodbye to those he visited. "You know what Jesus said," his uncle explained. "Sell what you can and give to the poor." Nick knew that in his uncle's house there was a special chest where his uncle kept a sack of gold coins that had been left for him by his parents. It was Nick's inheritance. "Should I give these coins to the poor?" he asked his uncle. "That is good that you should think about these things," his uncle replied, "but you are too young to make such decisions." By the time Nick was 14, he still had his dream of being a sailor, but he also pondered the example of his uncle's life. Perhaps the voyage God wanted him to take in life wouldn't be by ship to a distant port, but to people nearby. One evening, when Nick was walking past a neighbor's front door, he heard a woman weeping. There was the home of a husband and wife whose daughters were old enough to marry, but no one had married yet. Nick knew about their problem. The family had no money. In those days, it was custom that a father whose daughter was getting married had to provide the money or property to help the couple set up the new household. This was called a dowry. But because the neighbor's family was so poor, it seemed that none of the daughters would ever be able to marry and start a family of their own. Nick wondered if he should tell his uncle. Perhaps he would find a way to help. But it seemed to Nick that God had put this problem in his hands and no one else's. So his uncle had given him example of what to do. Nick made a secret decision. He knew where the key was to the chest where his uncle kept the gold coins left for him by his parents, and he had discovered that 3 gold coins would be just enough for a dowry. 3 gold coins would make it possible for the oldest daughter, Sophia, to marry. How happy she would be! One night, when his uncle was away, Nick opened up the chest and found the bag with his inheritance. He took 3 coins and put them in a cloth sack and tied it closed. In the dark of the night, he threw the sack through the open window into his neighbor's house, then slipped through away as quietly as a cat. Days later, the good news swept through the town that Sophia was going to marry Anthony, a friend of Nick's. It was a good match, and everyone said that 2 fine young people were perfect for each other. Sophia's parents said it was a miracle. A sack with 3 gold coins had been thrown into their home while they were sleeping. "Perhaps an angel sent it," said Sophia's mother, her face wet with tears of joy. It was hard to keep from telling the truth to his uncle about what he had done. But hadn't his uncle said that giving was more pleasing to God when only God knows the giver? Don't let your right hand know what your left hand is doing, his uncle had said, quoting the gospel. Let God be your only witness. The problem was that there were still 2 unmarried sisters, Macrina and Zoe. It had been easy giving 3 gold coins, but 6 more coins would mean that very little of his inheritance would remain safely locked up in the chest. It took 3 months, but at last Nick found the courage to throw a second sack with 3 coins into his neighbor's house. Not long after, Macrina married Paul, and still no one knew where the money had come from. There was still Zoe, the youngest daughter. Must Nick help her as well? Hadn't he done enough? Shouldn't he keep the money left in his chest for his own future needs? One day he happened to see Zoe walking home from the market and noticed sadness in her eyes. What right had he to worry about his own future when Zoe's needs were here and now? Hadn't Jesus said, "Don't worry about tomorrow"? That very night, Nick took 3 more coins from the chest, and with only the light of the moon to guide him, he tossed the last sack through the window. But this time someone spotted him. Zoe's father had been waiting in the shadows. "Ah, so it is you, Nick," he said. "But how is that possible? You're so young. A boy should care so much about our troubles. It's a miracle." "I'm only following my uncle's example," whispered Nick. "Please don't tell anyone." Zoe's father promised not to tell, but of course he told his wife, who felt it necessary to tell her brother, who told his best friend, who whispered to his next-door neighbor, who mentioned it to her husband. Each person knew the secret of one person and thought they could be trusted not to tell. Many days had passed, but soon everyone in Patara knew what Nick had done, and at last the story reached his uncle's ears. "I'm so proud of you, Nick," the bishop told his nephew. "I know your parents would be proud of you too. You cared more about your neighbor than yourself." Many years passed, then centuries, but the tale has never been forgotten. The story of Nicholas, who wanted to be a sailor, but who became instead St. Nicholas, the Bishop of Myra, a great wonder worker, when he was only a boy and gave away 9 gold coins. The end. All right, I hope you enjoyed that story of St. Nicholas, and I hope you spend a wonderful day preparing your lives and your house for Christmas. All right. Thanks, guys. I'll see you next week.